Carl Barks is one of the Disney legends.
He wrote adventure stories that somehow made people care about what happened to all these talking ducks.
Those beaks are hard to draw, and Carl could do it, and he could get any look he wanted out of them.
He developed Donald Duck in the comics. He was the Duck Man. Barks was a struggling cartoonist during the 30s, did a lot of magazine cartooning, and applied for work at the Disney studio and got hired as an in-betweener, became an animator, but he gravitated toward doing stories. His big thing was doing gag cartoons, and his gag sense was perfect for the Disney story department.
Carl was probably about 10 years older than most of the guys he worked with. He didn't come to it with the same kind of goofiness that a lot of the story guys did. I mean, cartoonists in general, if you get them together, and especially in those days, would play practical jokes on each other and goof off and act like overgrown kids, and he was kind of the adult of the group because he'd had just more life experience.
The story goes that Barks had a hard time with the air conditioning at the Disney studio. The Disney studio in the 30s and 40s was one of the first places in Southern California to have air conditioning. And his allergies were working against that. And he was looking for a way to work for the studio, but not at the studio.
Carl picked up an assignment for the first Donald Duck comic book, which was called Donald Duck Finds Pirate Gold. And it was taken from a story outline that they were going to do a featurette-length adventure cartoon. And strangely enough, it never got made.
The Western Publishing wanted to do a new Donald Duck comic book. So they asked the studio if there's a way to maybe take this story and adapt it. They got Jack Hanna and Carl Barks to redraw these storyboard panels as a comic book. And that became the very first original Disney comic book. It's the very first comic story drawn by Carl Barks.
But that was where Carl got a taste for doing comic book stories.
When they introduced Donald in the cartoons, he really stole the show, and he stole the show because he had a fiery personality.
But Donald really reflects the side of people that everybody knows is inside of them. He gets mad, he gets impatient, he's a hypocrite, he blows his stack.
This was the Depression, so people could relate to a character who was angry at the system, angry at life around him. So Donald Duck was really that kind of a character. Now, by the time 1940 rolled around, and 1941, we were getting ready and getting into World War II. The idea of an American was a fighter, was someone who's not going to take this. And Donald was a perfect icon for that, who spoke for us.
This is all great grist for the mill when you're trying to write something that's funny, because then it's also stuff people can connect with and relate to.
He had a personality. Cartoons of the early 30s really weren't. They really didn't have that. They were really just ink blots, in a way, moving around. They were dancing to music, and they didn't have a depth. That's something that the Disney studio pioneered all through the 30s, was personality animation, character animation.
She thinks you're a big shot. You probably look like a millionaire to her, a big shot playboy, but you're not. Suppose she could see you as you really are. You gangster.
When Carl took him to comic books, temper tantrums don't translate well to the printed page when you can't hear him and see him move.
Keep in mind that Donald on screen could only be heard in that trick voice of Clarence Nash's. In the comics, you can understand everything Donald Duck is saying, so now we could know more about who this character was. But beyond Donald, he expanded the role of the nephews, who certainly had a role in the films, but here they were more clever and resourceful and actually were the catalyst of a lot of their adventures.
For there, he created Gladstone Gander, who was the world's luckiest duck. He kind of was a rival for Daisy's affections as well.
He brought in these characters to frustrate Donald. You know, Donald, that was what Donald was best known for, being frustrated, you know.
And then the first Uncle Scrooge story, it's called Christmas on Bear Mountain. I think that was in the late 40s. It was a Christmas story, so Barks turned to the classics and borrowed Scrooge from A Christmas Carol.
Here was a guy who had 3 cubic acres of money and wouldn't spend a dime on a newspaper.
And if he's going to be a millionaire or a gazillionaire, he's going to have people that want that money, so then the Beagle Boys came along.
So there was a lot of comedy that could come from that. There was always people trying to get Scrooge's money and the very clever ways in which he'd have to defend it.
I mean, Uncle Scrooge was perfect once he became this multi-gazillionaire, because he had the money and the motivation to go on adventures that take Donald and the kids along, or to send them off on these adventures.
And it really set the tone for the Donald Duck and actually Mickey Mouse and other subsequent Disney comics for years to come. The characters in a grand adventure.
Carl's stories were always very well researched. They say he used National Geographics quite often for visual reference for drawing things accurately all over the world.
He did research on how people looked, or how the area of the world that they were going to would be.
I loved the adventure. I loved the fact that he was going off for this wildly fantastic treasure. And I ended up learning about world locations at the same time.
Carl Barks will be remembered really for doing that with the characters, for expanding their scope, taking them out of the little incidents that happened in short subjects and putting them in giant stories.
When I was a kid, every kid I knew had a subscription to Walt Disney's comics and stories.
I think one of the first ones I got was The 7 Cities of Cibola, which was just this fantastic story with booby traps and little idols and jewels and things like that, which actually helped inspire the opening sequence to Raiders of the Lost Ark later as well.
Many of Hollywood's greatest directors really take a lot of incidents and bits, and they'll put homages to Carl Barks' stories into their movies today. In Indiana Jones, the rock, that round rolling rock that comes after Indiana Jones in Raiders of the Lost Ark, that's taken right out of a Carl Barks comic.
They were stories that would have been just as home in an epic movie, and I think that's what really stuck with the George Lucases and the Steven Spielbergs.
The Disney studio knew that they had a good man, a good story man working on these comics, and they let him go. They knew he wasn't going to break any rules or have anything that shouldn't be in there. So he was allowed to just take his imagination wherever he wanted, and it's fantastic.
And nobody ever knew who Carl was. We always called him the good duck man, the good artist. We didn't know his name, but we could recognize his drawing style, and people would write to Western Publishing to try to find out who he was, and the word got out that this man's name is Carl Barks, and this was in maybe the mid-60s. He was a guy that liked writing and drawing. I think he liked being left alone to his own devices for the most part. His wife lettered the comics for him, and his editors were smart enough to leave him alone and let him do what he did best.
It's my pleasure to present you with the Disney Legends Award.
Well, thank you very
much.
I want to thank the Disney Studio for this award, not only for myself, but for all those comic book fans, the kids who used to buy those comic books for 10 cents and now sell them for $2,000. Thank you.
Barks really loved the world. You know, he loved the adventure of life, and I think that's something he could live through Donald Duck.
Carl's stuff has a lasting quality because it was done with conviction.
I think Donald ended up being living the life that Carl would have lived if he lived in Duckburg.